He didn't know this dying creature carried something worth more than everything he'd ever lost. Sometimes life disguises miracles in the ugliest places, in the cracks of dust, in the trembling of a broken thing still trying to stand. They say pity is a small act, but for Jack Callahan it would become the doorway to redemption. He'd walked into that auction with nothing left but pride and debt, thinking the world had already taken its last swing at him. But fate had one more lesson to teach, a silent, fragile lesson with a dull coat, hollow eyes, and a secret buried so deep it would take everything in him to uncover it. This is where his story began, in the quiet gasp before mercy met purpose. The auction yard was dying beneath a cloudless sun. Dust lifted from the ground like ghosts of forgotten deals, clinging to boots, to breath, to everything still standing. The air smelled of sweat and hay and something older, the scent of resignation. Men leaned against the railings, hats low, hands roughened by years of holding on to things that no longer wanted to stay. Jack Callahan stood among them, his face cut in the kind of silence that doesn't need words. His denim jacket was faded at the elbows, his boots cracked along the seams, his eyes as tired as the land that raised him. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker, desperate and hollow. Next up, lot 42.
Mare, estimated 18 years, no pedigree, sold as is. A low groan rippled through the crowd.
The horse was led out, ribs pressing like knuckles against her thin hide. Her coat, once chestnut, had dulled to the colour of old copper. Every step seemed borrowed. The handler tugged at the lead rope, but she resisted, head bowed, breathing slow and shallow.
No one bid. No one even moved. The auctioneer tried to joke. Come on now, someone give the poor girl a home, but even he didn't believe it.
Silence stretched. Somewhere, a windmill creaked.
A dog barked once and then gave up.
The horse blinked at the crowd, not pleading, not afraid, just waiting. Jack felt it before he understood it. A pull, quiet but firm, like a memory brushing against the heart. Maybe it was her stillness. Maybe it was how her eyes held no anger, only surrender. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after the accident that took his wife, in the mornings when the ranch was too quiet, and forgiveness felt like a language he'd forgotten. The auctioneer sighed.
All right, we'll move on. I'll take her. Jack's voice came out low, but it cut through the air like a blade. Heads turned.
A few men laughed under their breath. You sure, Turner? She won't last a month. He nodded once, pulling a folded check from his pocket.
I'm sure. The gavel fell with a hollow thud.
Just like that, the old mare was his. The crowd moved on to the next lot, attention shifting like birds from a barren tree. Jack walked toward her, feeling every eye linger just long enough to judge. He didn't care. He'd spent years being judged by his own memory. Up close, she smelled of rain and rust. He laid a hand on her neck, and she flinched just slightly. Beneath his palm, he felt the faint rhythm of a life refusing to quit.
A foolish purchase, maybe.
But as the dust rose around them and the auctioneer's voice faded behind him, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed. Something small and invisible, but certain as dawn. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he chose pity over reason, his past had begun to stir. The Turner Ranch sat quiet beneath a colourless dawn. The light crept over the hills, thin and uncertain, touching the roof of the old barn before sliding down to the fields that no longer grew anything worth keeping. Jack Callahan stood by the fence line, coffee cooling in his hands, watching the new mare do nothing more than breathe. Her ribs shifted under her coat with each fragile inhale. She didn't look much different from the land, worn, half alive, waiting for a reason to keep going. The ranch had once been something else. He could still hear laughter if he tried hard enough. Clara's laughter, the way it used to roll across the paddock when the sun hit the grass just right. Back then, the place smelled of life, linseed, oats, the sweetness of molasses in a feed bucket. Now it smelled like dust and regret. Jack walked to the barn, boots crunching over dry earth. The boards groaned as he opened the door, a sound like an old throat clearing itself. Inside, the mare turned her head, slow and cautious, eyes dulled but not empty. He poured a bucket of grain, set down a bale of hay that still carried the scent of last summer's cut. She barely touched it. He couldn't blame her. He hadn't wanted to eat much either in months. He leaned against the stall door and let the morning settle around him. The quiet here had weight. It pressed against his chest, the same way memory did when he let it. Clara's photograph still hung crooked in the kitchen, her hand resting on the neck of a young colt, sunlight spilling across both of them. That horse had been the start of it all, and the end too. He'd pushed too hard that day, driven by pride and fear that failure would swallow him whole. The colt reared. The gate came loose. Clara tried to calm it. He could still see the moment her feet left the ground, still hear the wooden rails snap like a gunshot. Some sounds never leave you. They only learn to hide until the night goes quiet enough for them to return. He'd tried to rebuild after she was gone. For a while he told himself he could keep the ranch alive in her name. But every nail he drove felt like penance. Every sunrise was another reminder she wasn't there to see it. His hands aged faster than the seasons. The men who used to work beside him drifted away, finding steadier pay and cleaner consciences. Soon it was just him, the wind, and the ghosts. The bank letters came in crisp white envelopes, polite at first, then sharp. He stopped opening them. The mailbox filled, then the kitchen drawer.
Debt didn't scare him anymore.
It was just another form of weather. What scared him was the silence, the way it made him remember who he'd been before everything broke. When he'd lifted his hand at the auction, he hadn't planned it. It wasn't kindness that moved him, not really. It was something smaller, heavier, guilt wearing the mask of mercy. Looking at that mare now, he could almost believe he'd done it for Clara. She would have told him to take the poor creature home, to give it rest. But deep down, he knew he'd bought her because he needed something weaker than himself to care for, something to prove he hadn't turned entirely to stone. The wind slipped through the broken slats, carrying the faint scent of rain from miles away. The mare raised her head, ears twitching. Jack almost smiled. "You're safe here," he whispered, voice catching like it hadn't been used in years. She blinked once, slowly, then went back to breathing. Outside, the horizon burned pale with the coming heat. Jack stepped out of the barn and looked toward the hills where the sun was climbing like an old promise. The ranch stretched before him, tired, scarred, still standing. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. Quiet, but real. He didn't know why, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest pull toward life again. The mare refused to die. Jack had seen animals give up before, seen the way their eyes dulled, the breath shallowed, the body surrendered. But this one, she kept fighting the inevitable with a quiet kind of defiance that unsettled him. He'd started calling her Willow, though she never seemed to hear it. Maybe he just needed a name to speak into the emptiness. The first week was nothing but small failures. She barely touched her feed. Her legs trembled when she tried to stand too long. Sometimes she'd just stare through the stall wall as if the world beyond it wasn't worth the effort. Jack cleaned her wounds, brushed her coat, whispered soft words he didn't believe in. He tried to remember the way Clara used to move around animals, gentle, patient, unafraid of silence. He wasn't like that. His kindness had always come wrapped in impatience. By the third week, the men in town had started talking. Old Ben, who stopped by for odd jobs, laughed when he saw the mare. "You bought yourself a funeral on 4 legs, Turner," he said, shaking his head. Jack didn't answer. He'd learned that silence was the only weapon left to a man without pride. His son Mark came once that month. He stood at the gate, arms crossed, the same eyes as Clara but colder now. "You're still at this?" he asked, looking past Jack toward the barn. "She's half dead, Pa. You can't fix everything with guilt." Jack didn't argue. He just nodded because words between them had stopped being bridges long ago. Mark left before sunset, tires spitting dust down the road. The silence that followed settled heavy like a verdict. Days blurred. The mare collapsed twice.
Once Jack thought she wouldn't rise again.
He lifted her head into his lap, feeling her ribs shift under the weight of his hand. "You can let go," he whispered, not sure who he was talking to. But she didn't. She lay there for hours, eyes open until the rain came. When the thunder rolled over the valley, she finally stood, slow but certain, and stared at the horizon like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. That night, Jack dreamed of Clara again. She was standing in the corral, brushing a horse that wasn't there. Her smile was soft, familiar.
"You never listen, Jack," she said, and when he reached for her, she turned to dust.
He woke to the sound of wind slamming the barn door. The storm had rolled in fast, dragging the sky down with it. Lightning flared white across the hills, painting the world in flashes. Jack pulled on his coat and stepped out, rain hitting his face like needles. The barn door swung open on its hinge, creaking wildly.
Willow was gone. Panic hit him like an old injury.
He grabbed a lantern and ran into the downpour, boots sinking in the mud.
"Willow!"
he shouted, voice torn by the wind. The rain blurred everything, fence lines, trees, the path to the pasture. For a moment he thought he saw her shape in the distance, a pale shadow against the black. He followed. She moved faster than he thought possible, her gait uneven but determined. The storm raged around them, lightning splitting the sky in crooked veins. She led him down the old trail toward the creek bed, the one that had dried out years ago. Jack's lungs burned. "Where are you going?" he muttered, half to himself, half to the ghost of his wife, who seemed to walk with him through every drop of rain. Willow stopped suddenly. She stood there, trembling, mud splattered across her flanks.
Lightning flashed again, and in that instant Jack saw her rear right side gleam.
Something glistened under the wet hair. A faint mark burned into her hide. He moved closer, brushing the mud away with his thumb. The rain hissed against her skin. A brand, faint, almost erased by time. 3 letters intertwined in a design he didn't recognize, at least not at first. Then the memory surfaced, like a name whispered from a grave.
FRS Forsyth Ranch. He froze.
That brand shouldn't exist. The Forsyth fire had burned that entire line to ash 20 years ago. Jack remembered the smell of it, the black smoke rising over the ridge, the talk in town about a hidden fortune that died with them. He remembered the sheriff's report, the way they said nothing had survived, not man, not beast. But here she was. Willow shifted under his hand, breathing hard but steady. The rain slowed, softening into a whisper. Jack stepped back, lantern light trembling. For a long moment he just stared at her, as if the years between then and now were collapsing into a single heartbeat. The wind carried the faint sound of thunder rolling toward the mountains. Willow's eyes met his, clearer now, sharper, as if something inside her had awakened. He felt it too, a pull in his chest that wasn't fear or wonder, but both tangled together. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows over the mud where his boots sank deep. He traced the brand again, this time with shaking fingers. There was no mistake. It was real. And that realization brought with it a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Jack stood there until the lightning faded, the storm moving on. The night was quiet again, broken only by Willow's breath and the slow drip of water from the trees. Somewhere behind him the ranch waited, old, tired, filled with ghosts. But out here something new had woken. He looked at the mare one last time, her ribs rising and falling in the dim light. Then he whispered into the wind, "What are you, girl?" The answer came not in words, but in the silence that followed, thick, watchful, and ancient.
That brand shouldn't exist.
Because the ranch it came from was destroyed 20 years ago, along with everyone in it. Morning came slowly after the storm, pale and cold.
Mist crawled across the valley like breath from something sleeping beneath the earth.
Jack stood at the barn door, coffee untouched in his hand, watching Willow chew calmly as if nothing had happened. The mark still burned in his mind. He'd scrubbed it clean in daylight, tracing the edges again, certain now that it wasn't a trick of the night. FRS, Forsyth Ranch. The past carved into living flesh. He hadn't said the name in years. Most people hadn't. The Forsyth place had gone quiet after the fire, left to rot. Time had swallowed the land, and those who'd tried to remember found their tongues heavy with superstition. Still, curiosity has its own kind of hunger, and Jack had always been a man who didn't know when to stop feeding it. That afternoon, he drove into town, the truck rattling like loose bones. The library sat behind the courthouse, its windows filmed with dust, the smell of paper and years hanging in the air. Mrs. Hensley, who'd run the records desk since before he was born,
blinked at him when he asked for files on the Forsyth estate. "Why dig that up?"
she asked, voice thin as tissue. Nothing left out there but ash. "Maybe I'm looking for proof of something that shouldn't be," he said. She studied him a moment longer, then sighed, and disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she carried a stack of old ledgers and a box of yellowed newspaper clippings. He spent hours at the table under the buzzing light, piecing together fragments of a tragedy everyone had stopped speaking of. The reports were grim.
Fire, unexplained.
Family presumed dead. Jonathan and Marjorie Forsyth, their 2 children, and 3 ranch hands.
No survivors. No cause ever found.
Some articles whispered of stolen gold, of Confederate coins meant for a bank that never received them. The sheriff at the time had dismissed it as a myth, but the rumor lingered. People swore the Forsyths hid their fortune on the ranch grounds before the fire. Others said it was cursed, the price for greed. Jack closed the last folder as the sun bled out behind the courthouse roof. He could have stopped there, let the ghosts stay quiet. But something in him wouldn't settle. That brand on Willow wasn't a coincidence. He felt it deep down, the way her eyes followed him, clear and knowing, the way she'd led him into the storm like she'd known exactly where to go. The next morning, he loaded his truck with water, rope, and a shovel. The road to the old Forsyth property was barely a road anymore, more a scar winding through the valley. The landscape changed as he drove, grass giving way to blackened soil, trees bent like old men bowing to memory. He found what was left of the ranch near the ridge. The ruins were quiet, stone chimneys jutting from the earth like gravestones. The main house was gone, eaten down to its bones. He stepped out, the wind carrying a faint metallic tang.
Almost like blood. For a while he just stood there, trying to imagine the place alive, the fields golden, the sound of children.
The rhythm of horses in the paddock, all gone in one night of flame. He was walking toward what remained of the barn when he heard the creak of a screen door. An old woman stood on the porch of a small shack beyond the fence, her frame thin but straight, her eyes sharp beneath a grey shawl. "You're trespassing," she said. Jack tipped his hat, cautious. "Didn't think anyone lived out here." "Not many do." She stepped closer, her gaze cutting right through him. "What are you looking for?" He hesitated.
"I found a horse."
Branded with Forsyth's mark. For a heartbeat, her face flickered. Surprise, then something else, something like fear. She shook her head.
"That can't be." "It is." The woman's hands tightened on her shawl. "Then you should have left her where you found her," Jack frowned. "You knew the Forsyths?" "I was Marjorie's niece," she said quietly.
"Lydia Forsyth. And if you have any sense, you'll turn around and forget that brand. Some stories end in ashes for a reason. What really happened here?" She looked past him, toward the skeleton of the barn, eyes wet with old pain. Fire doesn't always start with flame. Sometimes it starts with greed, with men digging for what isn't theirs. She stepped closer, voice lowering to a whisper. Whatever you think that horse will bring you, it's not peace. Leave the past buried, Mr. Callahan. Let the dead rest. Before he could answer, she turned back toward her house, the door closing softly behind her. Jack stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat. He didn't believe in curses, but the air here felt different, heavy and watchful. When he finally turned back to the truck, he caught sight of movement on the ridge. Willow stood there, mane lifted by the breeze, eyes fixed on him as if she'd been waiting. He hadn't brought her. She'd followed on her own, quiet as a shadow. He started toward her, but she only snorted and turned, walking a few steps toward the burned barn before stopping again. "What are you showing me, girl?" he murmured. The ground beneath her hooves was black and soft, the remnants of old fire soaked by last night's rain. She pawed at it, exposing faint glints beneath the mud, tiny flecks of something metallic. Jack knelt, brushing them aside, finding nothing but bits of rusted nail. Still, the gesture sent a tremor through him. When he looked up again, Willow was staring straight at him. Not at the ruins, not at the road, at him. And for the first time since he'd brought her home, he saw life burning behind those eyes, a strange alertness that felt almost human. Jack swallowed, the wind cutting cold across his neck. He could still hear Lydia's words echoing through the valley. "Leave the past buried." But as he watched the mare standing among the ruins, he knew the past wasn't done with him yet. He thought he was rescuing her, but maybe she'd come back to rescue him. The storm came without warning. By nightfall, the valley was swallowed in black. Wind tore across the ridge like it was trying to erase the land itself, and the rain fell in angry, slanted sheets. Jack was closing the barn doors when he realized Willow's stall was empty again. The rope hung loose, frayed at the knot, swinging like a heartbeat in the lantern light. He ran to the yard, calling her name. His voice vanished in the wind. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, boots sinking deep into the wet earth as he searched the fence line. The rain blurred everything, trees, hills, even the edges of memory. He followed hoofprints in the mud until they disappeared near the trail that wound toward the Forsyth ruins. His chest tightened.
Not again. The drive was treacherous, the truck sliding on the slick clay road.
Lightning flared across the valley, revealing the outline of the old barn ahead, a jagged silhouette against the sky. And there she was. Willow stood in front of it, soaked and trembling, her mane plastered to her neck. She looked straight at him through the storm, calm in a way that made no sense. Jack killed the engine and stepped out into the rain. "Willow!" he shouted. She didn't move. Instead, she turned toward the collapsed barn doors and took a single step inside. He followed, heart hammering. The smell of ash and wet rot hit him like a wave. Every board creaked underfoot, the ghosts of fire whispering in the dark. Lightning cracked again, and for an instant the interior came alive. Blackened timbers, skeletal rafters, shards of broken glass glinting in the mud. Willow pawed at the ground, snorting softly, her breath visible in the cold air. Jack raised the flashlight. "What is it, girl?" Her hoof struck something hollow, a dull metallic thud. He crouched, sweeping mud aside with his bare hands until his fingers hit rusted iron. A box, heavy, sealed tight, the edges eaten by years of weather. His pulse quickened. He pried it loose, the hinges groaning like old bones, and forced it open. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay a leather-bound ledger, blackened around the corners, but intact. Beside it, a ring of keys, small, ornate, each stamped with the same crest he'd seen on Willow's brand, FRS. He carried the box to a drier corner, brushing rain from the pages. The writing was faded, the ink spread like veins across parchment. It took him a moment to make sense of the words. Accounts. Forsyth Holdings. 1902 onward. The entries began with wages, debts, names of labourers, men he'd heard his father mention long ago when he was just a boy running through the paddocks. But deeper in the book, the numbers changed. Columns of gold coin tallies, notes about transfers, then a final entry, scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as if written in panic. Assets secured beneath the East Foundation.
Only JT knows fire will cover it.
Forgive me, Jack froze. His eyes locked on those initials, JT, James Turner.
His father. He sat back hard, breath catching in his throat.
His father had worked here, yes, foreman under Jonathan Forsyth. But no one had ever spoken of what happened that night.
Only that the fire took everything.
That his father died a hero trying to save the family. That was the story Jack had carried all his life, the one piece of pride that had survived the years of failure and guilt. He turned another page. A letter had been tucked inside, brittle and yellowed. It wasn't addressed, but the handwriting was unmistakable, his father's steady hand slanted to the right. If you find this, I failed them. The gold is safe, but I cannot face what I've done. The fire wasn't meant to spread.
Tell Clara to forgive me. Tell my boy to be better than I was.
The flashlight trembled in Jack's grip. Clara, his mother. She'd never spoken of this, not once. She'd buried the truth along with his father, leaving only the legend of the man he thought he'd known. Rain hammered against the roof, finding its way through gaps and holes, dripping onto the ledger's pages. The ink bled slowly, as if trying to take the words back. Jack closed the book, his hands shaking. The sound of the storm dimmed, or maybe the world had just gone silent around him. He looked at Willow. She was standing still, eyes fixed on him, her chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm. He thought of the day he'd bought her, of how she'd led him here twice now, both times through storms, as if she'd known the path before him. His throat tightened. "You brought me to this," he whispered. Willow stepped closer, lowering her head until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. He rested a hand against her neck, feeling her warmth against the cold. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his guilt. He felt witnessed. Outside, lightning flashed again, lighting the valley for miles. The burned ruins, the overgrown fences, the graveyard of a story everyone had forgotten. And somewhere beneath them, the Forsyth fortune still slept, hidden under earth and memory. Jack tucked the ledger under his coat and looked back at the mare. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, like she understood. Maybe she did. The storm began to fade, leaving only the sound of dripping water and distant thunder rolling toward the horizon. Jack turned to leave, the box heavy in his arms. Each step back to the truck felt slower, heavier. Every truth he'd uncovered came with the weight of another lie dying behind it. By the time he reached the ridge, dawn was breaking. Soft light spilling over the blackened fields. He stopped and looked back one last time at the ruins, the place where his father's sins had turned to legend. The truth he uncovered would shatter the one memory he'd spent his life clinging to. The next morning broke soft and colourless, the kind of dawn that looked like the world was holding its breath. Mist hugged the valley, blurring the horizon into something half-remembered. Jack sat on the porch with the ledger open on his knees, the pages rippling gently in the breeze. The words were still there, as heavy as the night that delivered them. His father's handwriting stared back, raw and human, a confession dressed in desperation. He'd spent most of the night turning those lines over in his head. The gold, the fire, the lie that had built his family's name. For years, he'd carried his father like a saint in memory, the man who'd died a hero. Now that truth had splintered, and something inside him ached where pride used to live. Willow stood by the fence, her coat shining faintly in the pale light, no longer the frail creature he'd brought home. There was strength in her now, something calm and sure. She turned her head toward him, as if waiting for him to make a choice. And maybe she was. By afternoon, Jack had made his decision. He loaded the ledger, the keys, and a small shovel into the truck. The road to the Forsyth ruins was still slick from the rain, lined with dark puddles that caught the sky like mirrors. The old woman was already waiting when he arrived. Lydia Forsyth stood on her porch, hands clasped around a mug of tea, watching the clouds move. "You came back?" she said quietly. "I found something," he replied. His voice carried the weight of it. Her eyes narrowed.
"In the barn?"
He nodded, offering the ledger with both hands. She took it like it might crumble at her touch, her fingers tracing the burned edges. When she opened it and saw the handwriting inside, her breath caught.
"I know this script," she whispered.
"Jonathan's, my uncle's?" Jack hesitated before speaking again. "But the last page, it's from my father." The silence that followed was thick, like the world itself was listening. Lydia sank slowly into the old porch chair, eyes moving across the words, her expression shifting with every line.
"He was trying to save them," she said finally, "not steal."
The gold wasn't greed, it was insurance. Jonathan had debts, men after him. Your father hid the money so the family could start again after paying them off. The fire... Her voice broke.
"The fire wasn't supposed to happen." Jack knelt beside her.
"You knew my father?"
"I was a child then," she said.
"But I remember him. James Turner, quiet, kind, always working late in the barns. He had a horse he loved more than anything."
"A mare named Willa, fast and clever."
When the fire started, they said he went back in for her.
"None of them made it out." Jack's throat tightened.
"Willow," he murmured. Lydia looked up.
"What? The horse I found."
"She has the Forsyth brand, but she's descended from that mare. You said you didn't believe me before, but she led me to the barn. To this," he gestured to the ledger. "It's like she knew." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "My grandfather kept one of Willa's foals after the fire. We raised her line in secret, saying they were cursed. But maybe they were meant to find their way home." She reached for his hand, trembling. "Your father's blood saved us, Jack. It's time someone carried that forward." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass, lifting the scent of rain and ash. Somewhere behind them, Willow whinnied softly, low, gentle, familiar. Lydia smiled faintly through her tears. "She's calling you James's boy." Jack rose, the weight in his chest shifting, not gone but changed.
"There's gold buried under that barn," he said.
"Enough to set a man right for life." Lydia looked at him carefully.
"And what will you do with it?"
He thought about the ranch, the crumbling fences, the horses no one wanted, the letters from the bank. He thought of Clara's laughter and the promise she used to whisper in his ear. "Don't just build things."
"Heal them." He shook his head. "I'll dig it up, but not to keep. Maybe it's time that gold did what it was meant to. Build something worth saving." Lydia reached into her shawl and pulled out a small medallion, tarnished silver, engraved with the Forsyth crest. "Then take this.
If you do this right, you'll be restoring both our names." That night, beneath a waxing moon, Jack returned to the barn with Willow beside him. The earth was soft from the rain, and he dug until his arms burned. The shovel struck metal dull and solid. Beneath the dirt, he uncovered a row of iron boxes, smaller than he expected, heavy with age. Inside, beneath layers of cloth, gleamed the impossible: rows of gold coins, some marked with the year 1863, the lost fortune, the burden of inheritance. He stared at it for a long time, the light from his lantern dancing off the metal like fire reborn. Then he closed the lid. Weeks passed. Word spread quietly through the valley. Turner Ranch was back at work. But this time, something was different. Instead of fixing fences and selling stock, Jack was building stables, wide and open, with soft straw beds and fresh troughs. He hired back the hands who'd left, gave work to those who'd lost their land, and brought in horses that others had written off as useless. Willow watched it all, her coat sleek, her eyes bright as spring. When Lydia visited months later, She found the place alive again, children running through the paddock.
Laughter where silence had once ruled.
Jack greeted her at the gate, his face weathered but lighter somehow. "You did it," she said softly. He looked out at the fields, at Willow grazing under the oak tree.
"I just gave back what wasn't mine to keep." She touched his arm, her eyes glistening.
"No, you gave it purpose." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and hay. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, one of the hands calling the horses in for feed. Lydia turned to go, but paused. "James would be proud," she said. Jack watched her walk away, the light fading behind her, and for the first time in years, the sound of the valley didn't ache.
It hummed, alive, whole. He turned toward Willow, who lifted her head to meet his gaze.
"Guess you found your way home after all," he murmured. She blinked once, slow and calm, the same quiet defiance she'd shown that first day. The man who thought he'd bought a dying horse had instead bought his second chance at life. The sun rose clean over the valley, gold light spilling through the cottonwoods, catching in the dust that drifted above the paddocks. Where there had once been silence and ruin, there was now sound, hammers, laughter, the steady rhythm of hooves in soft earth. The Turner Ranch breathed again. The barn stood rebuilt, its walls lined with stalls that no longer echoed hollow. The smell of hay and soap replaced the scent of mildew and loss. Horses grazed in wide fields, some scarred, some young, all carrying the quiet dignity of things given a second chance. Children from nearby farms came each morning to help brush and feed them, their small hands learning gentleness the way Jack once had, by instinct, not instruction. Jack watched it all from the porch, coffee steaming in the cool air. Willow stood near the fence, her coat glossy now, her body whole. She lifted her head when he looked at her, as if counting him among her herd. He smiled faintly. "We did all right," he murmured. The gold was long gone, melted, sold, transformed into fences, feed, wages, roops, but the wealth it built remained unshakable. The valley had come alive again. Neighboring ranches, once on the edge of foreclosure, now had seed to plant, hay to cut, horses to trade. The ledger that once carried guilt now sat on Jack's shelf, its pages pressed flat and quiet, a record of how broken things could still hold light. Sometimes, in the still of evening, he'd walk the ridge above the ranch and watch the sun sink behind the hills. The same hills that had burned long ago now shimmered with color. New grass, wildflowers, life. He'd think about his father, about Lydia, about all the names written and erased by time. He understood now that legacy wasn't what you left behind, but what you made right before you left. He had thought mercy was weakness once, the easy way out for men who couldn't fight hard enough. But now he knew mercy was the hardest thing a man could learn. It cost more than pride, more than gold. It demanded faith in others, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracle that life could begin again, even after everything had gone wrong. He thought of the first day he saw her, bones and dust beneath the auction light. He'd felt pity then, nothing more. But pity had led him to truth, and truth had led him to grace. Willow wasn't just an old horse he'd saved. She was the bridge between what was lost and what still could be found. The ranch lights flickered on as twilight deepened. A soft breeze moved through the grass, carrying the smell of rain and hay, that familiar perfume of the land finding peace. Somewhere down by the barn, a foal kicked up its heels, running for no reason other than joy. Willow turned her head toward the sound, ears twitching, eyes bright. Jack's voice came quiet in his own mind, not a prayer, not even a thought, just truth shaped into words.
Mercy is the only wealth that never burns.
Everything else turns to dust. He leaned against the rail, watching the sky fade from gold to blue, then to the deep grey of night. The stars blinked awake, scattered like coins across heaven. He wondered if his father was somewhere among them, watching. If Clara was too, he didn't need their answers anymore. The valley spoke enough for all of them. The wind in the grass, the laughter in the barns, the steady heartbeat of hooves carrying life forward. He looked once more at Willow, her shadow long against the fence line, calm and unmoving.
A smile touched his face, weary, certain, whole. He thought he'd saved an old horse. But in truth,
she'd saved the last good part of him. The years passed quietly, like pages turning in a book no longer rushed to its ending. Seasons came and went, winter frost bowing the grass, spring rains bringing it back to life again. The ranch held its rhythm now, not hurried, not hollow, just steady. People still came, some to see the sanctuary, others to leave behind horses that had nowhere else to go.
Every soul found a place here, every creature a name. Jack had grown slower.
The lines on his face had deepened, carved by sun and forgiveness. His hands trembled sometimes, but his eyes had never been clearer. He'd learned to listen, to the creak of the barn at night, to the soft breathing of animals asleep, to the voice of the wind whispering through the oaks. All of it told the same truth. Peace doesn't arrive with thunder. It settles in quietly once a man stops running from himself. One morning, before dawn had fully lifted, he walked to the stable with a lantern in his hand. The air was cold and new. Inside, Willow stood over a small foal, her last gift to the land she had reclaimed. The colt was pale gold, its coat still damp, its legs uncertain. Jack knelt beside them, the straw soft beneath his knees, the air warm with the smell of life beginning. He reached out, resting his palm against Willow's neck. She was old now, her eyes softer, movements slower, but the strength in her presence was unchanged. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "Better than me." She leaned gently into his touch, breath steady, heartbeat calm. The foal stumbled once, then found its footing, nudging close to its mother. Jack smiled, the kind of smile that carried tears without needing them. He stayed there for a long while, watching the sunlight creep through the cracks in the barn wall, catching in the dust until everything shimmered like gold. Outside, the valley began to wake. The first light stretched across the hills, golden and forgiving, spilling warmth over the land that had once burned black. The scars were still there, if you knew where to look, faint lines in the soil, but even scars, he'd learned, could hold beauty once the pain beneath them turned to memory. He stepped outside, the sun on his face, the breeze soft against his shoulders. The fields rolled before him, green and full, dotted with the shapes of horses grazing. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the corral where they were helping with the morning feed. The sound reached him like music from another lifetime. Jack turned back to the barn, to Willow and her foal framed in light. He felt something lift in his chest, something he couldn't quite name, gratitude, maybe, or grace. It had been years since he'd spoken to anyone about the fire, about the gold, about his father.
None of that mattered anymore.
What mattered was this. The land had forgiven him, and in its forgiveness, he'd found his own. He took a deep breath, the air sharp and clean. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "You found your way home." The sun rose higher, spilling its full brilliance over the valley. The barns glowed amber, the fences casting long, perfect shadows. Horses moved in slow rhythm across the fields, their manes catching light like threads of fire. From above, it would look like the valley itself was breathing, alive, renewed, endless. And somewhere, in that stillness, the truth settled over it all. The past was never gone, not really. It lingered in the wind, in the soil, in the blood of the living. But it wasn't there to haunt him anymore. Sometimes the past doesn't haunt us to hurt us. but to help us remember who we still can be